Originally, Andrea Buddensieg, my companion and colleague there, would have come, but she was not able. So I take a little bit her role, but we did together with Peter Weibel the exhibition, so I can explain a little bit of the background. First of all, I show you the place where we did this exhibition. It's a small town in Germany at the border of the Upper Rhine, Karlsruhe, across Strasbourg, and they founded in 1989, actually. They founded a Center for New Media Art, and it was opened in 1997. So it seems to be the biggest center for media art of the world so far. Huge collections and huge exhibition space. And this was a former weapon factory from the First World War. So it is a huge building, bigger even than the Centre Pompidou, but only in space, not in importance maybe. So Peter Weibel, the video artist and theoretician, is the director of the chairman of this CEO of this institution. And 7 years ago, we were sitting together and we had the following conversation. Originally, the ZKM, Center for Arts and Media, was founded to represent new media art because it was new. But what to do after 10 years or 15 years? Is media art still new? No. So what is actually new in principle? So we decided to try out the theme of the globalization in contemporary art. And so we started a research project in 2007, 2006, as you can see, with a series of conferences and with publications and building up materials. So we have, I think, 200 volumes of biennials and so on, working materials. And for instance, it started the Global Challenge of Art Museums. It was called GAM, Global Art in the Museum, because we thought this is a point within globalization which can be fixed, which can be talked about, the museum. But then we turned away from it, but it was original, our fixing point. So you see the first conference we had was the Global Challenge of Art Museums. The second conference, Where is Art Contemporary? Was very interesting because we brought together 30 museums directors from all continents. And they talked about their present problems, their present visions, and why everything is changing in their institutions. So for instance, the director of the University Museum in the Philippines, he met the University Museum director of Mexico, and they discovered that they have similar problems and that they want to discuss it. So for us, it was very interesting to see how things develop in other parts of the world. Develop is the wrong word, change, let's say, or emerge at all. So we started also, we made workshops with Goethe-Institut, for instance, in Sao Paulo, in New Delhi, in Hong Kong, and then also in Beijing, where we said, this is what we're doing in Karlsruhe. What is the local situation? How do you react to this? And this was great success in a way because everybody thought this was just the team to choose. Whereas in Europe, or especially in Germany, I always have to defend, but as if I had invented the globalization. Or what is happening? What is changing? What can you tell me? So this was very reassuring to listen to the discussion in other parts of the world on this topic. So we brought out several publications. You see 3 of them here. And then Peter Weibel, who is a curator, of course, in the first place, said we have to make an exhibition. I am no curator at all, and I was very resistant to this project. But then we embarked on doing this exhibition, the Global Contemporary Art Worlds after 1989. So we had a committee, curatorial or advisory committee, Ngone Fall from Senegal in Africa, Patrick Flores from the Philippines, Carol Lu from China, and Jim Supangat from Indonesia. And they advised us how to go in which direction and so on. So it became a huge exhibition, and before the exhibition opened, even quite a time before, I could sense that it would be very difficult to show a choice of contemporary artists and explain these are global. So the German public would not understand what it is. It looks very familiar. What is global here? So I decided to start on a documentation. What is new in other parts of the world? So they have a completely different part, which was not an exhibition part, but a documentary part. And this was very controversial because the other team members thought, why do we need this? But I insisted, we need something to show a German audience what is happening in the world, because they don't see it in Germany. They don't. And so we had the so-called Room of Histories, not of history, but of histories, because which kind of narratives are told today in the world and where? So we had different aspects like documents, when did it start, with what did it start, art spaces, how museums change worldwide. Then we had a special installation by Rashid Araeen. I will come to this back. Then we had a section on mapping and a section of branding. So you see here, we had each space was a different subject. The art branding was the art market, and mapping was the origin or the, so to speak, emergence of new art worlds, which complement and add to the one existing art world, the center and periphery, and so on. In the same time, for this volume, which we brought out not as a catalogue of the exhibition at all, but as a theme book, as a guidebook to this subject. For instance, one of my contributions was I read almost 3 years every month the International Art newspaper and selected those articles which related to the topic. So the documentation is here categorized in different aspects like what is new on the market, what is new in the institutions, and so on. So I will briefly talk about the documentation before talking about the exhibition. In the Room of Histories, we started with what we call documents, the global term, in which we gave a survey on the global vocabulary. When did these terms originate? And it turned out there are many usages of the word global, but none is older than 30 years, with one exception. That is Marshall McLuhan, The Global Village, which was 1962. But he was the unique forerunner. Otherwise, there were many things like world art and so, but the global vocabulary started actually around 90, and in the 90s became a very rich. Today, one meets the globalization of art in Mexico in the 16th century. So everybody speaks about the global, but this is very recent. The second thing, we choose 1989. Well, we took a decision to choose it, not because it is 0.0, but because it would interest the Germans, because the Berlin Wall was falling in 1989, and so Soviet empire collapsed, and economy, the international economy changed, but also because in the same year, 1989, there were the first exhibitions which aspired to show a global view of the world. In the same year, 1989, from which we presented a timeline with all what happened in, for instance, the invention of the internet, not yet profusion of the internet, but the invention of the technique of the internet. And then you see Art in America in July 89 brought an issue, the first time, with the title The Global Issue in July 89, and the same issue brought a review of the first exhibition of contemporary art which maintained that it was global, namely Les Magiciens de la Terre, the famous exhibition in Centre Pompidou by Jean-Hubert Martin, who lost his job as director of the Center of Centre Pompidou because of this exhibition.
But he got this museum.
Yes, but then he became director of the Ethnological Museum, and he lost the museum. This time he didn't lose his positions, but he lost the museum because it was transferred to the Quai Branly Museum. So this is the story. So the press immediately hailed in Paris that this was a landmark exhibition which changed things. But I will mention other events of 1989. Namely, in February was the first avant-garde exhibition, great national avant-garde exhibition in China, in February, which was closed after 3 weeks. Then there was the third biennial in Havana, which was headed by the denomination Third World Art, Third World Art. They wanted to show several hundred artists under the heading Third World Art. In October, November, in the same year, 89, Rashid Arain, the Pakistan-born artist in London, did his famous exhibition, The Other Story, namely the other story of modernism. We have told the wrong story, according to him. We excluded the rest of the world in modernism. Now he tells that there were already modernists. So that was the other story. And so there were a lot of events which showed, mostly in the West, still, this is agreed upon, but showed that something changed. So you see here a view of the space on documents and landmark exhibitions. And of course, here you see the Centre Pompidou, and then the scandal in Jean-Hubert Martin's exhibition, namely the British landmark land art artist and the Aborigines artist on the floor. That is a coexistence which was regarded at the time as an insult on the art scene. So I will not talk about this exhibition more, I will just talk about the exhibition as such. The second space was art spaces, where we collected 17 museums throughout the continents, which we asked to give us materials, texts, which we could show what they wanted to do, their visions, their practice, and photographic materials, including the cultural districts of Abu Dhabi and, at the time, but is still awake, in Hong Kong. So it became obvious that these spaces are all called museums, but they represent a very different idea of what a museum is. In fact, we had a second documentation, a second thing for this section, namely museums as concepts of what museums are. And this is also very interesting. There is a lot of different context of how museums today are regarded, but I will be shorter. Now the third space was dedicated to what we call the reading room. This was an installation by Rashid Arain, whom I mentioned before, who exhibited the 110 issues of his periodical third text, which actually is the only really radical new art critical publication, in my view, starting in '87, in order to, with a cultural critique of the art politics of the time. He had started in the 60s in London as a kind of Pakistan minimalist artist, but then he was so unsuccessful, he had so little success, you cannot imagine how artists of non-Western origin, even in the 80s, what problems they had. It's today unimaginable, but it belongs to the history of the subject. So he decided in the 80s, I stop making art, I will edit an art journal and write articles for this art journal. So this is an amazing project, and so he turned art praxis into another level, from art making, from object making to publication making. So he was one of our, so to speak, prophets or theoreticians, whom we wanted to show in this exhibition. Here you see all the editions of his journal Art, third text, Third World, of course, Politics, from '87 to the present day. Then we had a section on branding, the art market, where we showed the relation, the location of the art market, for instance, the emergence of Hong Kong as one of the most important art centers or marketplaces of the world, the rise of Chinese art market, which is now #2 on the world after the United States. So this is unheard of, because if you think that '89, for the first time, were shown 3 Chinese artists in the Magicien de la Terre in Paris. The role of the auction houses is, of course, considerable. I cannot talk about this, but this was part of the documentation. And you see, for instance, Philippe de Perret here, which is also, looks for me new, has auctions which are geographically presented, Africa, the BRIC countries, and so on. And then our last section was mapping. And we showed that from '89 to the present day, the number of biennials increased from 9 in '89 to 140 today. So we did not really, we document only one speciality of the biennials, namely their importance to start a new mapping of the world. So actually, it is not the mapping of the global world, which would be no mapping because it is global anyway, but art worlds which did not exist before. So as I mentioned already, the third world perspective of the Havana Biennial, which addressed the question of center and periphery. And then what for me is one of the most interesting phenomena to be discussed in this matter is the Asia-Pacific Triennial, which Australia started in 1993. So they created practically an art world which did not exist before, Asia-Pacific, and this was a turning point for Australia to change its situation in geopolitics and to address or approach its Asian neighbors. So it was of great political importance for Australia to start this. And, you know, they have these triennials in Brisbane and others to create an art world of, there was, of course, the Asian art world, which included Japan. Now there are Middle East phenomena, the Pan-Arabica of the Gulf states, where there is a series of new publications. And so you can see, and all this documentation centered in a big panorama screen film where we represented the changes in the 2 decades as a kind of dynamic process. So this was the purpose of this documentation, to tell the audience, the local audience, that even if they could not see that anything changed in the art scene, they have to inform themselves that things change in the other parts of the world. So I stop here, because now we could speak about the exhibition. But before we speak about the exhibition, I am very well prepared. I am willing to answer questions.
How you would describe the term art world? Even here in this, with the case with this exhibition, we have it in plural. So, but what is the art world as a system? How you would describe this term?
Well, you know, probably as well as I do, that Arthur Danto invented this term in 1964. And he doubted even in the 90s, when he wrote again on this subject, that the single art world was still possible. But he defined the art world from the side of philosophy. And so it became a kind of common term, which lacked any really theory, except that it was a concept invented for the center. You know, the art world is the Western art world. And so these new art regions, they are called regions, regionalisms and so on. They are opposite movements to decentralize the art world and to create art worlds of their own. I mean, this is their intention. We did not invent any new theory on this. As you can say, as art historian who wrote on the end of art history in the 80s, it was a certain pleasure for me to see that art history in the last 2 decades has to be told in very different ways. And we just wanted to document what happens, more than commenting on it.
On the level of the, may I, just one more question. On the level of the documentation, it's interesting for me, did you trace a certain, let's say, development from 89 to present time of the term global? Because probably it changed a lot at the beginning, how it was imagined, in particular in relation to the other cultural or art contexts, and then in present time, which is actually, it is a very active term, and it has...
Well, I mean, everybody hates this term, and for obvious reasons. But I only can say it was first new, and then it became inflationary. I would love to have post-global, but we are not yet at the, we are not yet. So I mean, this term says everything and nothing. But it is important, that was our explanation. We did not want to separate the term global from contemporary. It is not the colonization of the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. It is contemporary. And in that respect, it means there are new participants of the game, You were not just part of the game before, and who insist that they are contemporary with, of course, with whom, you can guess. With whom? With us, to be contemporary with us. And also I see Eastern Europe can be discussed. So global is an entrance ticket for many things. You know, it's just a general entrance ticket. To say global means not a universal world, because that was a modern Western world. No, it means a polycentric, contradicting world where many things happen, but contemporary.
Is it equal to universalism?
Pardon me?
Is the term global equal to universal, or
No.
it's an opposition?
In opposition, exactly opposition. It is, so to speak, of course, you know, global economy and all that is, we suffer all of this. So this is another thing. But in the art scene, it means an opposition against the former universalism.
One of the answers to Gladia's question is that, I guess you're going to talk about it later, it's the notion of archipelago that Glissant did about, you know, it's not the one world, it's different worlds that are connected, but you have to take the boat, right?
No, yeah, but when you say worlds, maybe the frames of the institutional system and the structures could be also different. And this is what I actually was implying. Do you think that the art worlds has or share the same structure still, although they're different in different contexts, or you trace some slight institutional and structural changes which actually gave you the
No, it's not this case that I want to define new art worlds. I look how they define themselves, not me. And what you said was very important, because we had a film about Glissant in the exhibition by an African filmmaker. And he talks in his last interview film where he was crossing the Atlantic and gave this interview, beautiful film. He talks that we have emigrated from the continent of the modern world into an archipelago, an island world, which has a new, I mean, this is a little bit utopic, because the global economy is, you know, is not in favor of this, on the contrary. So for me, it's a kind of cover ticket, which, I mean, you have two questions. On the one hand, global, and on the other hand, art worlds. The art worlds are not global, the new art worlds. They are regional. Asia-Pacific art world is not global, but exists, and now we could talk about biennials, exists because biennials are, so to speak, a kind of crossing, a kind of interlace, which brings, which favors. So our answer to biennial question was that it favors the origin, the emergence of new art regions. That was my answer.
We decided that I should take over when the first time, in connection to mapping, when the first time of the issue of biennials comes up. So I'll jump in and
it's there.
Yeah, and so that was my contribution to the exhibition and work, which is known here. It's called Gastarbeiter, and it consists of calculation based on my documentation of how much money was spent on my career between 1991, when I started exhibiting internationally, and January 2000, when a curator by the name of Carlos Basualdo invited me for an exhibition in Moderna Museum in Ljubljana. And the exhibition was titled Worthless, the Question of Value in Contemporary Art. So worthless presumed either like the pyramids, something you cannot attach a monetary value to, or something which is complete garbage. In this work, there is a personal story of globalization, if we take it from the point of view of the exhibition and the discussion now. There is a second volume, there should be a second volume for the next decade, but I haven't made it and I don't intend to make it. But I will just share a few points from the work. And it's related to biennials. But before that, in connection to the art worlds issue, I have a little comment to make, because from my personal experience coming out of Sofia in the beginning of the 90s, having already spent some time in New York as a nobody in the 80s, and knowing the notions of art world and various other things like what is a curator, who are the important curators and so on, in the beginning of the 90s, Sofia felt like a pocket of a third world in a country which is defined as a second world. And I felt in a very much, I think what interests me is pockets of third world in the first world, let's say. For instance, in one biennial, a few years back in Santa Fe, New Mexico, there were contemporary artists who live on the territory of an Indian reservation, in this case, Santa Clara Pueblo Indians. They were contemporary artists, but they still live in a pocket of third world, because in a tribal situation. And that's very interesting in Sofia, in the case of Sofia, in these 20 years, from a pocket of so-called contemporary artists. And for a long time, we were struggling with what kind of term should be used for the practice of all these artists in the beginning of the 90s. But the sign of the mark, when you were transformed from just a pocket surrounded by modernist folklore of post-Cézannist painting from the Artists' Union or something like that, it's when you feel like already like an art world of Sofia. And this transformation has happened within 20 years. I cannot tell you when it happened on a Monday, or I don't know the date. But now we do have here an art world of Sofia, and so there is an art world of Plovdiv and Varna and so on. Then going back to the work, there are four biennials which mark the globalization. Number one, the first biennial in Asia as such, in Korea, in Gwangju, 1995. Almost all the aspects of a clash between a nomadic artist going to a very regional situation. Gwangju is the third largest city in South Korea. Were there. The clash was, the food was so heavily local that even the very fancy art dealer from London, Nicholas Logsdale, and from Lisson Gallery, he couldn't tolerate it. And he was definitely much more global than I was. The language was so different, there was only one Ginny Pike assistant in the office who could speak with all the artists. The equipment was so, the economy was so protected that video artists who needed to use Sony equipment, they couldn't, because they were expected to use the Korean product Samsung equipment. So it took a decision of the government of South Korea to allow Sony equipment to be carted in on forklifts just at the moment of the press preview. And imagine people like Douglas Gordon hooking up, rigging up cables and video players for the opening. It's unimaginable. At the same time, the level of participation was extremely high. And it was like one of the generation-defining exhibitions, artists such as Gabriele Orozco, Douglas Gordon, Ricky Tirvanidja, Diana Thatter, Mauricio Catalan, Karsten Hjoller, Ernesto Nieto, Kcho, Kim Suja, Pedro Cabrita Rice, and so on and so forth. And then the worst, and this is the last example I'll give, some of you may have heard this story. It's a story that is featured somewhere there in Gastarbeiter. The worst, however, were the mornings and the installation process. The mornings, because most of us lived in a dormitory for Korean officers, an army compound, with a very good intercom. So every morning at 7:30, there was an announcement in perfect English on the intercom. Good morning, dear artists. It's 7:30 in the morning. It's time for you to wake up, have breakfast, and get on the bus to go to the biennial site, so you can start working on your installations. That was, I still remember it. It was like for 2 weeks, unimaginable. So coming from post-totalitarian country and encountering this kind of military setup, that was a shock. Then during the installation time and everybody running out of time and out of hands to work, to help, they invited office workers from the municipality who only messed up. They didn't help at all. Somehow the exhibition opened, and there were, afterwards, statistically, there were 1.6 million visitors to the compound. It's true that apart from the biennial, there were already also 5 other exhibitions in the same compound. Okay, this is the beginning, encountering the process of globalization and coming from supposedly second world, but kind of European country, One detail was very significant. The artists came from different regions of the world, and each region had a separate curator. The most visible from the United States, Kathy Halbright. Now she's very top brass in in MoMA. She curated Rirkut and Gabriel Orozco and other artists from USA. Then we had Europe 1 and Europe 2. I was obviously in Europe 2, curated by Ander Rothenberg, and there was Rosa El Hassan, Jura Lederman, and some other artists from Europe 2. Now, the victory of globalization in art was Singapore Biennial 2006-2008. I participated in the first and the second. And they had the first one, which had much bigger budget, had 800,000 visitors in a city which is, at that time, it was around 4 million people. But it's true that there were many venues in public space, so you cannot really calculate who was a visitor, who was just a passerby on the street. However, the interesting part about connection between art and globalization as a phenomenon of global finances and economics is that for the first two biennials, Singapore always had to have some sort of alternative motive. It seems like it wasn't enough just to have an art biennial for the city. There had to be another event. So parallel, the first biennial was scheduled parallel to the meeting of the International Monetary Fund. And then, of course, when all those people came to discuss global economics and finances, they were taken to see the biennial. They encountered there, I was doing a work from the cycle Schadenfreude guided tours, so I was making guided tours and I had a chance to meet these visitors. The second biennial, even more interesting, was parallel to the first Formula One event in Singapore. So they coincided. So everybody who came for the Formula One went also to see the biennial. And of course, the whole city was transformed, at least downtown, because of the Formula One. And you had to follow the march route of the track in order to go to the venues, because you just cannot cross over the barricades, actually, but not real barricades, but barricades for a sports event. And then we go to this year, 2013, when there is no longer so much money for biennials, where my experience tells me that biennial is happening only and when there is, in a certain city, a minimum of an art world and a minimum of sponsors who wants to have the world come to my village, to my region. Now, in 2003, I participated in two biennials, but I will mention a third one in which I did not participate. And these biennials tell me that contemporary art has won. Contemporary art can go anywhere, anytime, for any reason. It can work with budget or no budget. It can work with any issue. It's extremely flexible. It has transformed into something completely different. It is culture nowadays. Contemporary art is no longer, it has very little to do with traditional notions of art. It is already cultural activity as such. It's just it's almost like folklore. And it becomes folkloric when it goes to a certain city. Now, these biennials are, number one, a biennial in Konjic, in the city of, near Sarajevo, in Bosnia. It's a biennial that takes place in the nuclear bunker that was designed and paid for by American money at the end of the 70s for Tito. So it was finished in 1979, and Tito died in 1980, and it was never used. So now inside, Bosnian armies kept it during the war, and now inside it is transformed as a location where a lot of visitors go there just to see this amazing structure. It's like a cave deep into the mountain. It's very claustrophobic, it's air conditioned, and so on and so forth, very controlled environment. And now Bosnia wants to transform this place into a museum of contemporary art, and they have budget for five biennials. So this is, contemporary art can go deep into the mountains, in the bodies of some artists, international, good or bad, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anymore. Any artist could substitute for somebody else. It's just the decision of the curator. And then the other biennial, which I participated in, is in Odessa. I didn't go there. I signed a work, but this I'm not going to mention. I'm going to mention the so-called Internet Biennial, which a colleague of ours, Yara Bubnova, advised, and I'm not sure who, I think Iskra might be participating, no? Who is, Stella might be participating, Vasileva. It's for younger, basically emerging artists, maybe Ivan, I'm not sure. Ivan Mulov, are you participating in the Internet Biennial? Yeah. So there are some artists who here present who participate in the Internet Biennial, and that was conceived by Jan Hoot. And there were more than 30 international curators who were advising, suggesting young artists. So contemporary art could go into the mountain, or could go on internet, anywhere. And it will be just as efficient or inefficient, if you wish, as if it doesn't matter anymore where it goes. I've exhausted actually my agenda. And going back to the work, it is like a diary. So it consists of pockets of cases where I can prove with my documentation how much money was wasted on my career without sales. So it's only money spent on hotel, airplane, per diem, catalogs, as best as I know. I mean, I can prove that.
I have a remark. The Korean thing was very funny and interesting, but he didn't mention that afterwards, Samsung bought out Sony. Really? Yeah, of course. Are you sure of that? Oh yeah, absolutely. I remember very well. Samsung, Sony.
Well, this was the time before smartphones. As far as the exhibition, I feel like we have to go back to the exhibition and the issues raised by the exhibition. So the questions might refer to both parts of our presentation.